90th episode of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast was released, and it was an interview of John Williams. John Williams is co founder of Antinatalist advocacy along with Lawrence and Don. So, in the episode, they talked about antinatalist advocacy, they talked about antinatalist advocacy website, and also the antinatal conference that they had organized in 2023. And perhaps they might do one more conference in 2025. So, we hope for that. And also about antinatalist advocacy podcast. Now, one thing which John mentioned was that he does not think he is the right person to drive community building within the antinatalist space. And the reason why he thought he is not the right person was because he thinks he does not have that fire under his belly, to use his own words, to drive this community, to be someone who is, shouting and rallying the troops and so on. And I thought this was a little unfortunate because anti-natalist community, if there ever is such a thing, is just a bunch of shouting cats. We keep on shouting at each other for the smallest of the things under the name of debate, which is not always civilized. And so, the last person we would need to do community building in this sort of situation would be another shouting person. In fact, somebody who is calm, somebody like John, who is, has a calm temperament, has a balanced way of thinking things, has a strategic outcome based approach, and has very balanced head on his shoulders, is somebody who is the best person to drive this community building activity in antinatalism, is what I thought. Therefore, I thought this was a little bit unfortunate. But at the same time, I want to say that I respect any choices that he makes for himself. Now, they also talked about another controversial or another controversy that had happened because of a controversial argument that John had given earlier before this episode. So let's get into that argument. Before we do that, let's have a look at the problem that John is trying to solve. It is a problem of contradiction, it's a problem of inconsistency. That if you care for wild animal suffering and want to reduce it or even eliminate wild animal suffering, and at the same time you are an antinatalist and you think that people should not be having children, then human extinction is not going to solve wild animal suffering. Even after humans have disappeared from the face of this planet, suffering in the wild will go on, could go on, and it could be argued that it might even increase because all the space that humans are occupying right now on this planet would be given up for wildlife, and the suffering might be increased. A case can even be made contrary. So, this is the inconsistency that John is trying to solve. And to provide a solution, he makes an argument. So, that argument has some premises, some assumptions before that. Those are given that there is a genetic component which significantly dictates the traits like having a predisposition to caring for animals, to caring for wild animal suffering, having compassion, having empathy, having an ethical view of things. There is a genetic component which dictates these things. Given that there is such a genetic component, and given that our action is not going to result in increase in the total number of new human beings created, and given that we take a consequentialist view, which means that consequences matter more than the means to achieve those consequences. So given these three things, when a person who cares for wild animals and wild animal suffering, he goes into a sperm bank and donates his sperm so that his good genes, so called good genes, which would result in a child who would also in turn care for wild animal suffering and so on, would be propagated. There would be somebody else who would be created to care for the problem of wild animal suffering. Then John says that the action of this person who is going to the sperm bank and donating his sperm is not incompatible with antinatalism. That is the argument that John is making, or at least that is the argument that I understand from what John is saying. Now, this argument has many nuances into it, and I don't want to take a binary position of whether John is right or wrong, or whether this is antinatalism and that is antinatalism, and so on. I would rather want to dig out some nuances and explore some of the parts of this argument. One point to note here is that the outcome which John is intending here, which is to be concerned about wild animal suffering, is not necessarily within the realms of antinatalism, or at least directly into antinatalism, according to John. So John does not think, as far as I know, that any action that prevents procreation of wild animals is not necessarily directly antinatalism. It can be informed by antinatalism, so it is indirectly linked to antinatalism, but the outcome in and of itself is not an antinatalist outcome, if I understand what John is saying. That is one point to note. Now, because this argument has so many nuances, it is unsurprising that he got some backlash, and it was in two forms. One was, this is eugenics. You are talking about selective breeding, you are talking about good genes versus bad genes, whatever they are, and that's eugenics, which is kind of true, but it is a different kind of eugenics. And in the episode of Exploring Antinatalism, Amanda touches upon this point, that the eugenics which generally the pronatalists carry out, or at least a section of pronatalism is dedicated to, which is that certain people should not be procreating because they're bad people, and in order for them to be stopped, in order for us to stop them and not um, overcrowd us, we should be having more children. That is sort of a negative eugenics. In fact, this can go to extreme levels in, they did under Hitler and so on. So that's not what we are talking about. We are also not talking about fetishizing good genes. So there are some people who, generally on the pronatalist side again, who have this sort of a fantasy that my genes are good and that is what I am here for, to spread my own genes, so that this world becomes a beautiful nice place with all my copies. That I don't think is necessarily the case here. So even that sort of positive eugenics is not which is being talked about. This, if at all, this can be called as eugenics. It is selective breeding, if I have to use that word, or selective procreation, which tries to select out the traits which cause suffering. And Amanda points out that this is not entirely incompatible with the what antinatalists like David Pierce are trying to do in their transhumanist endeavors. And also, I want to point out that the non-identity problem, one of the problems which David Benatar's asymmetry is trying to solve, has this component in it. So the problem goes roughly like this. There are many variations to it, but roughly, imagine there's a couple who wants to have a child, but for some reason, if they have that child, it would not be good for that child. So if they have, let's say, some genetic disease, hereditary disease, which that child would inherit and go through a lot of suffering, and the doctor advises, no, hold on, don't have this child right now, wait for 6 months, take this medication, get your disease cured, and then have a child. And most of the people would agree that they should wait for 6 months. But in reality, what then would happen is, after 6 months, they are having a completely different child, and they prevented the original child from coming into existence because did not want this child to suffer. This is kind of selective breeding. And if we agree to this non identity problem being a problem in and of itself, then we are implicitly agreeing to some eugenistic hue, some eugenistic shade being present there. A similar case could be made in this case. I'm not taking any sides in this case, whether this is right or wrong. I'm just pointing out that the complexity of eugenics is more than just Nazis going out and preventing some people from procreating. So yes, John, not surprisingly, got this backlash saying you are a eugenicist. This is eugenics. This is wrong. Blah blah blah. Okay. The second backlash that he got was, no, this is not antinatalism, or no, this is not compatible with antinatalism. This action of a person who goes to a sperm bank and donates his sperm so that he propagates his so called good genes, which can produce this trait of caring for wild animal suffering, is not antinatalism. That was the second backlash. Now, and they talk about this at length in the podcast. What I want to do is, instead of taking any sides, binary sides, I want to imagine how an antinatalist could respond to this sort of argument. So one way to respond is to deny the consequentialist view itself, saying that you are, no matter what the consequences are, you are using that child as a means to your ends, and before being born, that child has no interest in solving your problem whatsoever. So this is more of a duty based or deontological view. So this is a completely different set of normative ethics. In the assumptions itself, if we are saying that we are putting forth a consequentialist argument, an argument based on consequentialist view, then putting a different set of normative ethics might not necessarily be a completely valid response, but that could be one way to respond to this. Another way is to deny that the total number of new human beings created remains constant. And to do that, what we can do is we can scale this action up. Either that person goes once to donate the sperm bank, and after that, he continues to go, and following his actions, many other men and people start doing this. And so the problem scales up. Now, sperms are available cheaply, and that would definitely, inevitably result in more new humans created. But John could respond to this saying that I am not talking about the scaled up situation. I am talking about this one particular action by this one particular man, if that action is antinatalist or not. So he can draw a boundary, draw a scope of this argument, however arbitrary it may be. He can say that this one man goes once, or this one man goes maybe 10 times, but no other people follow him. He can draw a boundary there and say then that's why this response might not be valid. Another way is to deny the assumption that there is a significant genetic component dictating a trait which produces a person with a predisposition to care for animals, to have empathy, compassion, and ethical view, and wild animal suffering, and so on. Now, John would say that, and he did respond like this in the podcast, that it is not necessary that a genetic component has to be there. You could also build an argument that a person goes to a sperm bank and donates his sperm and gets some money in the compensation and uses that money for good. Now, the problem with this is that this sounds a little bit like changing the goalposts, because your original problem was trying to solve wild animal suffering and the inconsistency between that and antinatalism. That is not at play here. You are just trying to earn money by some means here by donating sperm so that you can do good. And Amanda points out the necessity of this, that why is this necessary? You can earn money by other means. Why do you have to go and donate sperm to do some good things? To which John might respond, he didn't do it, but he might respond saying that this person has done everything else he could to earn money and do good. On top of that, he's also donating his sperm, so whatever extra money he can get, he can utilize to do good. And he also says that this is not in violation of antinatalism, because this is equivalent to me going to an arcade to play some games and influence schedule of other people such that two people somewhere in the vicinity were actually not going to sleep together but end up sleeping together and having a child, or vice versa. They were going to sleep together, but because I went there to play, their schedules were influenced and they did not sleep together and they didn't have a child. What his point is, we are influencing and changing the identity of the person who comes or who does not come into existence all the time. So, in this case, also by donating sperm to a sperm bank with the assumption that the total number of new human beings created remains constant, meaning that if I don't, somebody else will donate the sperm and then another child would be created. All I am doing is changing the identity of the person who is coming into existence, which is not very dissimilar to I going to, arcade and playing games and influencing schedules of people. That is the response given by Johns for this particular argument. The other thing is that to make this an antinatalist case, John could also say that this person goes to the sperm bank, donates his sperm, gets some money as compensation, and uses that money to sterilize some animals, or uses that money to sponsor some vasectomies. And so the outcome is so strongly antinatalist outcome. Then you can say that, see, at the cost of creating this particular child, or not even cost of creating this particular child, at the cost of changing the identity of a child who is going to anyway come into existence, I have saved these many beings from coming into existence. Two things here is that to say this, to actually make this a case of antinatalism, John has to recognize that concern about wild animal suffering and preventing wild animals from coming into existence comes under antinatalism. And I don't think he does that. I don't think he thinks it comes under antinatalism. So then that outcome does not become an antinatalist outcome, and then it's slightly hard to justify this action as antinatalism. But he could still build a case saying that I take that money and sponsor some vasectomies for humans. That could still be the case. Now, to that point, Amanda actually brings up a good point that in chapter 6, Population and Ethics of Better Never to Have Been, David Benatar proposes a case where the antinatalist dream comes true. Everybody agrees to antinatalism. What do? We don't stop procreating all of a sudden in one day, because that's going to cause a lot of suffering. Instead, David Benatar proposes a phased extinction, though, so there would be a period during which we phase out human population while before reaching human extinction. So there would be a period during which it would be permissible to procreate and use those children as a means to achieve our extinction. And this is in line with Benatar says one is consequentialist view, but also has weak deontologist view. And if Benatar proposes that, then Amanda says this can very well be extended to include wild animal suffering, to include all sentient beings, and say that we should have a phased extinction of all beings, humans and sentient beings, such that we keep on reproducing and phasing out ourselves so that we can coincide human extinction and extinction of rest of the sentient beings. And if that is the case, then we don't need this complex thought experiment of going to a sperm bank and donating to sperm. We can easily say that we can have children, although lesser and lesser number of children, until such an extinction happens. This could be an antinatalist view or it could be a pure extinctionist view or both, especially given that it is a chapter in Better Never to Have Been. But that very rightly is brought up by Amanda. So, in the light that John's argument might be converted into this form to make it antinatalist. Overall, I think this particular episode was interesting for two reasons. One, they had this lively debate, and two, they had this lively debate in such a civilized manner. So thank you, Amanda and John, for doing this. Fifth episode of Julio Cabrera's criticism of Benatar was released. Now we know that Benatar is pro-abortion, and he calls his view as pro-death, but we'll call it pro-abortion in this argument because that's what Cabrera calls, and Cabrera is anti abortion. So Benatar thinks that if you are pregnant, first of all, don't get pregnant and don't impregnate anybody. But if at all you get pregnant, it is a moral obligation for you to abort before a certain period. You are morally obliged to abort. That is Benatar's view. Whereas Julio Cabrera says that abortion is immoral. That is the difference between the two, and that is where this criticism revolves around. Now, before we go ahead, we should note that both these positions, both Benatar and Cabrera, are not talking about legality. They are only talking in the moral realm about what is immoral and what is moral. They are not talking about what should be legal and what should be illegal. In fact, Cabrera is also very clear in this particular episode that he is not in support of criminalizing abortion. And this is important to note considering the political situation in the world about abortion. Another important note that Cabrera makes is that antinatalism is about not procreating and it is not about eliminating that which has already been procreated. And so he says that any stance about abortion, whether it is pro abortion or anti abortion, has to be inferred from antinatalism. That means that in the original definition of antinatalism, whatever that may be, people have so many different definitions, but the stance on abortion is not within the definition of antinatalism. What that means is that if you are an antinatalist, it does not automatically mean that you have to be either anti abortion or pro abortion. You have to infer your stance from the original argument for antinatalism. And Cabrera says that Benatar does this in four steps. Although he says that Benatar actually does it implicitly, he does not know these steps that he's taking to infer his stance. So, what are those four steps? The first one is it is science. We should refer to science to tell us when somebody comes into existence. Now, it's not a precise moment. Science does not tell you precisely when a sentient being comes into existence or when a fetus all of a sudden becomes sentient. But there is a range of period before which, according to science and empirical observation, we can say that that fetus is not sentient. And after that period, that fetus is sentient. But that period is a range, and I think Benatar in Better Never to Have Been mentions like some range in 20th weeks, like in 20s of weeks of the gestation period, after which it is sentient, before which it is not sentient. This is based on scientific and empirical observation. That is the first step. The second step is based on the interests that Benatar proposes. So, Benatar in Better Never to Have Been proposes four kinds of interests. One is a functional interest. This is an interest of for anything to function properly. So, for example, we can say that a car has interest in being oiled or a car has an interest in being repaired. Now, in my understanding, this is just play of language. I don't think car has any interests, but we can say that for a car to function properly, it has an interest in being repaired, in being provided fuel, and so on. So this is functional interests. The second type of interest is biotic interest. These are similar interests, but interests of a being who is biological being. So, for example, a plant has an interest in being provided sunlight, in being nourished, and so on. These are biotic interests just because they're similar to functional interests, but now they are being held by a biological being. The third kind of interests is conscious interests. These are the interests of a being who is conscious. Now, for example, a baby has an interest in being fed. A baby has an interest in continuing to exist. She also has an interest in not being harmed, in not being tortured, and so on. So here it is not necessary that the being is aware, self-aware of themselves. The being probably doesn't even know who she is. She doesn't even get a question of what who she is. But she has an interest in terms of the surrounding that she lives in, and she is conscious. So these are conscious interests. And the fourth type of interests which Benatar refers to are reflective interests. These are interests of the beings who are self-aware, beings like us who can think about ourselves, who can question who we are, and then have interests and actually consciously select even between the interests. These are the interests which are reflective interests. And Benatar says that for a being to be morally relevant, only the conscious and reflective interests are necessary. The functional and biotic interests are not necessary for us to decide whether that being is morally relevant or not. And this is not new. I mean, even vegans think that it is okay to kill plants because they don't have these conscious and reflective interests, and therefore they can't suffer. That is the whole point. That why is Benatar saying that conscious and reflective interests are the only two interests which are relevant to decide whether the being is morally relevant or not? Because thwarting those interests would cause suffering in that being. Whereas if a being only has biotic or function interests, thwarting those interests is not going to cause suffering in those beings. That's why he says these last two interests are morally relevant. That is a second step to identify the interests and then take your stance in terms of interests. The third step is timeline. So once we have decided the interest in the gestational period, when we are talking about abortion, we can say that the conscious interests are acquired at certain period in the gestational period, so like for 28 weeks or 22 weeks or whatever the scientific consensus is. At this point we can say that the conscious interests start getting acquired by the fetus. Before that they are not. So the timeline is the next step in taking an abortion stance. And here, if you are anti-abortion, sorry, if you're a pro-abortion, then Cabrera says that abortion for you then would just mean late abstention, and abstention from procreation would just mean premature abortion. There is no real difference between aborting a fetus of, let's say, 20 weeks against a scenario where you don't get pregnant at all. In this particular pro-abortion stance is what Cabrera is saying. So timeline is the next step, and the last step to reach Benatar's pro abortion stance is the principle of not harming, that we should not cause harm to the being who is coming into existence, is enough. That's the last step for us to decide. There is no other principle we need, as per Benatar, according to Cabrera. So these are the four steps which Cabrera is trying to criticize. So the first step, which Cabrera says we have to rely on science to tell us when a being comes into existence. He says that is not the only sense of existence. There are other senses in which we can think of a being has come into existence. So, for example, when conception has happened and there is a fetus, there is something in the body of a woman, we can say that that being has come into existence in the sense that we have already brought that being into this situation, into this society, into this country, class, whatever, from the society's point of view. So, from our point of view, that being has come into existence. We can assign some attributes to that being already. In fact, the fact that there is a problem that we have to decide about what to do about this being tells us that somebody or at least something has come into existence. This is different from a situation where there was no conception, there was no procreation, there was no problem facing us about deciding what to do with something. But the fact that we have this problem tells us that something has come into existence. Benatar calls this existence from others. And he calls this, he gives a term, he gives a name for this kind of existence, calling as facticity. It is a factual existence which provides a raw material, and not only the biological raw material, but philosophical raw material to later on transcend into active existence. And so Cabrera says if coming into existence means beginning to have conscious interests, specifically interests in existing, we will be pro abortion. Because what we eliminate has not yet come into existence. But if coming into existence means gaining a facticity, a presence for others in the world, we will be anti abortion, since that which we eliminate has already come into existence in this other sense. And this other sense of existence is what Cabrera says is important because it is the raw existence. He also refers to other existential philosophers like John Paul Sartre, Heidegger, and Albert Camus, and so on, to explain this position. But essentially, he says this is the raw existence. It provides the raw material for later on for the active existence. That's why he says abortion prevents raw life from being transformed into a chosen and projected life. So, in Cabrera's view, this existing being is somebody who we are harming. It doesn't matter who that being is. That's why he says abortion is immoral not because it harms a person with a defined identity, but because it harms someone, whoever they may be. So he says the identity of the person is not important. And so Cabrera says that pro abortion argument has some circularity in it, because pro abortion argument says that a fetus does not have a defined identity. So abortion is okay, while the act of abortion prevents that being from gaining an identity in the first place. This, Cabrera says, is like accusing someone of not reading books while at the same time burning down their library. Now, you might say that we are not talking about identity, we are talking about interests. And this was something Cabrera did not say, but the same circular argument can be made for interests also. That a fetus does not have interests, therefore abortion is okay, while at the same time that abortion, that act of abortion itself, is preventing that fetus from gaining those interests. That is the circularity that Cabrera is trying to point out. The second step is about interests, that David Benatar says that only conscious and reflective interests matter, and if those interests are not gained so far, then abortion is okay. Cabrera says that this is true only in case of this first person perspective of existence, when there is somebody who feels that for it to be. But from a second and third person perspective, that existing for others perspective, from our perspective, the somebody has come into existence, and from that perspective, it is not enough just to restrict ourselves for these conscious and reflective interests if they exist or not, because potential interests are also necessary. We can imagine that fetus after acquiring those interests, would think that it was not in her interest to be aborted. So therefore potential interests are also important. Therefore Cabrera says that restricting only to these conscious and reflective interests, if they exist right now, is not enough. The third step was about timeline as to when those interests were acquired, and before that it was okay to abort. And Cabrera says that there is a difference between abstention from procreation and abortion. He says abstention is a truly preventive act, whereas abortion is a therapeutic act where somebody has already existed and we are trying to eliminate that existence again. So this is similar to earlier criticisms, but the step of timeline, he says, is not very relevant, at least as far as I could understand what he's saying. The last step, that it is enough for us to follow the principle that we should not harm anybody to reach this anti abortion, to reach this pro abortion position. Cabrera says that that is not enough. We also have to consider the principle of non manipulation. And in the case of abortion, we are doing manipulation of something that already exists. And therefore, this step is also not valid. Now, Cabrera acknowledges that if we don't abort and if we can let the woman carry the baby to the term, then we are also exposing that being, that baby, to whole lot of manipulations in their actual life. To that, Cabrera does not actually provide any counter argument as far as I could see in that episode. Finally, Cabrera tries to show that his anti abortion stance is not incompatible with original antinatalism. Firstly, he gives example of many women who don't want to have children, but once they get pregnant, they don't go and abort either. They have the child. So he says that it is perfectly possible for anybody to be anti abortion and an antinatalist. Secondly, he says that non manipulation as a principle is as important as not harming somebody as a principle. And thirdly, he says that imagining a fetus not wanting to be aborted and having an interest in not being aborted is not incompatible with antinatalism, at least his flavor of antinatalism. And he compares that to the earlier versions when he was talking about David Benatar's asymmetry, where he had said that when we are considering the counterfactual case of a potential being having potential interests, then we can think that that potential being have an interest in not being harmed, but also would have an interest in being benefited. So we can think of that potential being of being deprived. In a similar way, we can imagine of this fetus having a potential interest of not being aborted. So, on these 3 points, he says that an anti abortion position is not incompatible with antinatalism. Now, as far as much as entertaining this episode was, I should say that I don't agree with Cabrera. I am still a Benatarian antinatalist and I take a pro abortion stance. I'm just not going to criticize Cabrera for the simple reason that these are proper professional qualified philosophers and I am not qualified enough to do to criticize Cabrera. So I'm just presenting what Cabrera has said, just summarizing that his criticism to Benatar without actually agreeing with Cabrera. There was a video on a big channel called Clark Ellison. This is a big channel with more than 300,000 subscribers. And they had a new video with the title The Desire to Have Never Been Born. This video now has got like 42,000 views by the time of this recording of this video. And it was an interesting video. It included a lot of references to works of many philosophers. Most of them were continental philosophers, and also included works like movies and anime movies and so on. It was a 36-minute long video, very entertaining video, very clear audio, nicely, and you can enjoy listening to it. And Lawrence also made a live stream to it. I'm going to put links to both of these things, the video, original video, and the live stream in the description. But I want to point out one thing. The video talked about desires, and the video does not say this clearly, but I think there are four different desires and there is antinatalism. So the four different desires are desire for the self to not have existed in this world. That's one, like to not have been born. That's one desire. Then the desire for this world itself to not have existed. These two desires could be said to be having antinatalist inclinations. And then there is a desire for the self to cease to exist, to no longer exist. And then there is also a desire for this world to cease to exist. These two later desires more of come from a suicidal thought. They are inclined towards pro-mortalist or suicidal side of the things. And these four desires can interact with each other quite intensely and sometimes absurdly, because it is very hard, as the video itself says, to imagine the time before your existence or to imagine the place without your existence, because you don't exist to imagine that you don't exist. That is one conundrum the video allures to. But these four desires can interact each other, they can inform each other also. So my point is this, that these four desires are different than antinatalism, or at least the antinatalism that I understand, the Benatarian antinatalism, the analytic antinatalism, which is more about building some sort of structure, some axiological structure on the values that you hold. And that does not necessarily have to be a desire. Like, I don't have a desire, necessarily speaking, on an emotional level, for me to end my life, or a desire to not have been born. In fact, some antinatalists might even be thankful that they were born. And there is nothing wrong with that, because you can recognize that behind these desires and these emotions and these biases are the evolutionary reasons for why we have these things. But they are separate. In fact, that is the whole point of some of the arguments for antinatalism, that we need to recognize that these are separate than the reality that we go through, that the reality of suffering and harm that everybody has to go through. So, antinatalism to me is a logical structure based on the values that we hold, which is not necessarily a slave of the desires that we have. We can have all kinds of desires. Antinatalism is coming out of those desires and looking at those desires as a third person and evaluating which of these desires are reasonable and which are not, which are reliable and which are not, and so on. So those are the five things I would say. One is antinatalism and four desires. The video sort of confuses between these two things, having desires and antinatalism. It doesn't make it clear, and also it doesn't make it clear about these four kinds of desires and their interaction. Although it talks about that in more of a non-analytical way, but very entertaining video. There's an interesting channel called Meta Ethics. I think that's because the creator of that channel is Ethan Mehta. I think he's in Australia, and they have put up a new video with the title "I Met David Benatar." And they, in fact, did meet David Benatar by the looks of it. It was in that Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which happened in Sydney. So, this person, Ethan Mehta, went there and actually met David Benatar in person, and therefore he put up this video. And I want to put up a little warning here. Benatar does not show his face, and so we don't know how he looks like, and so on. So that sort of generates a curiosity in terms of, how does Benatar look. But at the same time, we should be careful here about this sort of thing. This can lead to a sort of a cultish behavior. Let me explain what I mean. There is a place in India called Varanasi, and it is a holy place for Hindus. And among Hindus, or at least among the Hindus that I was brought up in, there is a culture of, if a person goes to Varanasi and comes back home, you touch their feet, that person's feet. So there are two reasons for that. One is Varanasi is a holy place and that person has been to that holy place, and touching feet is a gesture to for three things: to get that person's blessing, to show respect for that person, and to also show respectful affection to that person. And this gesture is, somebody who is not familiar with this kind of thing might not necessarily understand it, and that's understandable. But it is so internalized within the community here. I mean, although I don't follow these things anymore, but I can experience the feeling of that internalized feeling of showing an affectionate respect to the person while touching their feet. So that is what you do to the person who has gone to Varanasi and who has come back, because you can't yourself go to that holy place. You do it through this means, by touching their feet. Why I'm bringing this up is, if more and more people start meeting Benatar and putting a video that I met Benatar and people start watching that, we might, replicating this sort of cultish behavior. I am not accusing Ethan Mehta to intentionally be doing this. Definitely not. But this might inadvertently happen if more and more people start doing this. And I want to warn against that, because as it is, we are already accused of being a cult. And a cult does not have to have a face. Benatar actually does not have to show his face for this to happen, because you can have a faceless cult leader. I mean, Islam is the great example of that. After all, whether it is Hinduism, Islam, or whatever, I think religions are just extended cult gone wild. So Islam is the best example of a faceless cult, and this can go in that. We are already accused of being a death cult with this. Then this sort of behavior would just reinforce that stereotype. So I would just want to warn against that. So if that is the reason to watch this video, don't watch this video. But there is a more valuable and deeper reason for watching this video from Ethan Mehta, and that is the two questions that he asked Benatar, which he discussed here. The first question that he asked was about David Benatar's asymmetry, where the fourth quadrant, which says that absence of pleasure are not bad, that is based on the premise that absence of pleasure are not bad unless and until there is somebody who is deprived of those pleasures. Ethan Mehta has actually also made another video talking about this, that if we regret absence of pleasure, if we think that absence of pleasure is bad for the being who does not exist, and we can think it in our own case retrospectively, that had I not been existed, I would have been deprived of all the pleasures that I today enjoy, and that would have been bad. You can think of that. And that is what Ethan Mehta says. If that is the case, would the asymmetry be nullified? And Benatar actually just pointed him to the part of the book where he actually has addressed this problem already. The problem the Benatar addresses is in terms of regret, and Ethan Mehta also goes through that. I just want to quickly go through it. On page 38 and 39, Benatar says this judgment is too strong because if the absence of pleasure in scenario B is bad rather than not bad, then we should have to regret X for X's sake, that X did not come into existence. But it is not regrettable. And to this, Ethan Mehta says,
taking regrettable to mean able to be against one's preferences, I am not convinced by this argument because I see no reason to accept premise 2. That is, that it is not the case that it is regrettable that X did not come into existence. And Benatar provides no such reason. He merely states, but it is not regrettable, without providing any justification for this proposition, and then moves on.
so let's be reminded of the fact that Benatar's asymmetry is an axiological asymmetry and not a logical asymmetry. What that means is the asymmetry is drawing on the already held values that we have. It is not trying to dictate what values we should be holding. And therefore, Ethan's question here, that what is the reason that we are not regretting excess not existence, is out of the scope of the argument for asymmetry. Benatar is not providing any justification for the fact that we don't regret the non existence of X, is not because he doesn't maybe have a justification. It is because he's not dictating it either way. He's basing his asymmetry just on the observation that we don't really regret the excess non-existence. And to support that argument, on page number 35, while explaining another asymmetry, Benatar says nobody really mourns for those who do not exist on Mars, feeling sorry for the potential such beings that they cannot enjoy life. Yet, if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars, but that Martians were suffering, we would regret this for them. The point is that we regret suffering, but not the absent pleasures of those who could have existed. So, Benatar is only stating a fact that exists in our lives, in our values, that we don't regret the non existence of a being and therefore missing pleasures. He does not have to provide a justification for that. He's just basing his asymmetry on that fact. And therefore, Ethan's question is completely valid, but not in the scope of the asymmetry. Rest of the part, Ethan also brings up another question about if the increasing human populations help reducing wildlife and therefore reducing wildlife suffering. Increasing human population is good. It's a different question. I'm not going to address that because that also in and of itself has so many branches and nuances. but I just wanted to address this part about asymmetry. A significant channel called Short Fat Otaku, with their 155,000 subscribers, made a video, Why Aren't People Having Kids? Even though the title was Why People Are Not Having Kids, the video was all about why women are not having kids. The tone of the video mainly blamed women for not having kids. The video cites some studies to show that on an average 10% of women in any given population would not want to have kids, and another 10% of women will naturally not be able to have kids. That is just the nature's way about humans. But in America, over 50% of women don't want to have kids. So what explains this 30% gap? After all, women are just sheep acting by their own natural instincts and can't think for their own self, right? So the explanation is an antinatalist propaganda spread by people like Amanda Suknik, who, by the way, herself wanted to have children but could not. So, to cope with it, she became a communist, rejecting the hierarchical nature of winners and losers in nature, and started making videos about antinatalism. That's it. That's the perfect explanation. So, if Amanda is watching this video, please take a note that we know what you actually want more than what you know what you want. This can't get any more ridiculous. Just don't watch that video. There's a new page published on antinatalistadvocacy.org website, 5 steps to doing good. The intention, it seems, of this page is to help those who are antinatalists, those who identify as antinatalists, or at least are sympathetic to the cause of antinatalism, to help them to do some good. Some very interesting 5 steps are mentioned here, and we'll quickly go through them. The first one is don't have any more children. So the curious thing is they mention any more in the brackets, which means that you might have children and then become an antinatalist. That is very much a possibility which they are recognizing. So just don't have any more children, don't procreate more children, which is obvious given if you are on an antinatalist website and if you are writing steps for antinatalists. But one thing which I notice was that the reason they are saying this is interesting. Not reproducing, of course, carries the benefit of not imposing harm on the person we would have created, but it also means that we would have avoided the opportunity cost that comes with raising children. Okay, so whatever money you would have spent on that new child, you could utilize that to help existing people, is the idea. And therefore, I'm curious to know what their position is on adoption, because in case of adoption, you are helping a child who is already existing. But at the same time, the other side of it is that you are focusing all your resources on that one child. Whereas if you don't adopt, you could distribute those resources to maybe 10 children, 50 children, whatever. That's the other side. And then the question comes, where do you draw the line? At what line do you say that the benefits are so sparse that they are not effective, and therefore it should be 50 children for this much amount and so on? That is a very arbitrary standard, and it will be dependent on the situation, on the location, and so on. So I guess that's arbitrary. So that's why it would be interesting to know what their opinion is about adoption in this case. But anyway, good step. Don't have any more children. The next one is become vegan, and this is, I know it's very controversial in the antinatalist circles. There are debates, continuous debates going on between non-vegan antinatalists and vegan antinatalists, but they say that become vegan is the second good step to not having children, and I wholeheartedly agree with this. By becoming vegan, you are not contributing to bringing into existence new beings, which include farmed animals in this case. So, absolutely become vegan. The third one is plan your career, and they sort of on a high level tell you 2 points about it, that working directly for the organization which do good. So, you can plan your career such that you want to work for maybe some charities, if you want to work in charity sector, which directly do some effective good, or you could work in professions which can help to do good. For example, they mention you can work in politics, you can work in medical research, journalism, and in this way also you can help achieve some good ends. Interestingly, they also mention research and development, example, developing alternative proteins, among others. So, this pretty much is plant based proteins, vegan proteins, because if you provide alternatives to people which are plant based, automatically they would shift to plant-based lifestyle, if not fully vegan. So yes, nothing to disagree there for me. And then the next one is earn money to donate to organizations which are doing good. So basically, do whatever you're good at, do work in your profession, earn as much money as you can, so that you can help the organizations which are doing good. You can donate the money. One point of caution, they say that you have to set the boundaries. So, one thing to note here is to be wary of not overstepping sensible ethical boundaries in pursuing higher quantities of money, such as what had happened in the collapse of cryptocurrency exchange FTX. This is Sam Bankman Fried scandal that had happened under the name of effective altruism. But overall, yes, absolutely, you can do this. The third one, of course, which follows on from the earlier step, is start donating. You can start donating to different charities. You can start with smaller amounts first, get into the habit of donating instead of directly jumping into it. Gradually increase your amounts and manage your donations to a reasonable and practical way. Now, personally, whenever I have tried to donate to animal charities, I have made it a point that I am going to donate to causes which are focused on not bringing new animals. I have consciously not donated to rescue efforts. I have donated to some rescue efforts exceptionally in exceptions. But as a rule, I have maintained that I would be donating, let's say, for example, of sterilization of stray dogs or cats, or I have also donated to PETA in the past, but I've made sure that the donation is meant for sterilization of animals. I have in fact called people in PETA to understand what exact cause I am donating to. And in the cases where they've said that this is going to go for rescuing some horses in such and such place, then I would say that no. Can the horses be sterilized? If they can, I'm ready to give you money. But if they can't, then I'm not. And in those cases, they have said we can't sterilize horses. And I said, then no, I would not be donating. So I have tried to focus my donations towards antinatalist causes, even in animal charities. And I think that's a strategy which works for me. Not necessarily it should work for everybody, but this step talks about that donating activity. And the last step, of course, is build antinatalist community. This is easier said than done, way easier said than done. It is extremely hard to build an antinatalist community. But what they suggest is start with a smaller but a better community. Instead of, spawning your net too wide and far, just start with a focused small community who have a better understanding, who are coherent and can work as a team to then increase the community. So you can also have support groups, and many young people I have seen need support in the cases where they don't want to have children. And there are cases where if I don't want to have children, how am I going to get a partner? What about my marriage? What about people at my home? They are not accepting of my views. What do I do? And so on. And in the traditional Indian context, these problems become even more severe, is what I've seen. And these young people do need some sort of support groups. One downside of that side I have seen is that then most of the activities and discussions start focusing towards child freedom rather than antinatalism. In fact, many of these people are not even interested into the ethical aspects, the philosophical aspects of antinatalism. And that's the unfortunate reality we live in. We have to sort of, in my experience, try and achieve a balance between, yes, we want to help people who need support in their life because of these child free stances that they intend to take. But at the same time, we want to sway the drive. We want to, try and bring these people on to this philosophical side of antinatalism, which is more robust, which is more deep, and so on. It's a very hard thing to do. I have not been very successful in doing that, but that is something I have thought about. And this step also talks about building the antinatalist community. So these are the 5 steps. They have added new page. Of course, they have put in a lot of help links across the page, in different steps about your career, about different organizations, and so on. So, very good page overall. And I would like to thank John and Lawrence who are behind this, I know, for doing this. There was an article on fortune.com, and it was saying that Elon Musk and other pro-natalists who are asking people to have more children are running essentially what can be called as a Ponzi scheme. Now, this is not the Ponzi scheme which David Benatar has called. David Benatar has said, if I remember this correctly, that pro-natalists or the act of having children so that you can gain meaning in life is a Ponzi scheme, because you gain meaning by recruiting more people, by having more children. And in that sense, it is a Ponzi scheme, because then your children would need to have their own children to have meaning in their life, and so on. This Ponzi scheme in this article is not that philosophical Ponzi scheme which is referred to. This is an economic Ponzi scheme. So at one point they say, without direct intervention from governments, any additional wealth that's created usually ends up with people who already have higher incomes at the expense of workers and consumers they added. Seen this way, pronatalism is a Ponzi scheme. It relies on new entrants to produce returns for earlier investors, with the burdens falling most heavily on women, who are responsible for the bulk of childbearing and child rearing, often without adequate medical care or affordable childcare. And the article ends by saying that, seen through this lens, pronatalism offers a hollow ringing promise that simply having more people will solve social and economic problems faced by a nation's current population. Now, it is no wonder then that Elon Musk got irritated because of this article. He retweeted this article of Fortune and said something deeply misanthropic about these people. It is not actually misanthropic. Pronatalism for economic gains is highly unethical. It is just using sentient beings, using humans as a means to an end, and especially for nefarious ends, as this article says.